Hi, so many thanks for joining us today as we give a brief intro into some of the topics that can be challenging for entrepreneurs and SMEs. It's a really exciting journey that you're all on, and sometimes I think the number of obstacles ahead of you could seem overwhelming. So we thought it'd be useful to maybe just take a few of those areas that are topical at the moment, which you may not be able to keep on top of, and give a taster into why they matter. And as we go through these slides, you'll see a QR code on each. That's a link to our ebook, which can also be sent to you afterwards. So I'm Fiona Kiernan, I'm founder of Zeumed, which is a health economics and policy advisory company working across Europe and the Middle East. A big piece of our work is in digital health, and we look at that both from the payer side, so we think about how they should fund innovative technologies, and that means we get to know what concerns them. But we also look at it from the manufacturer side. So we help teams to get their products launched, whether or not that's through how to communicate value to funders or buyers in hospitals, or for submission of HTA dossiers for those with digital therapeutics. And please do connect via LinkedIn or through the details that we'll share later on.
All right, thanks a lot, Fiona. And I'm Rafał Nowicki. I'm working as CTO at ULAM Labs. And we are basically a custom software development team that is working with UA, UK, and Europe healthcare companies since 2017. So while Fiona works on the market and founding side, we work on the other half. I mean, building the product and getting it ready to run inside the healthcare system. And that's really why we are doing this together today. So we keep seeing the same things from two different perspectives. But the product doesn't fail because the technology is weak. So it fails because the healthcare system around has its rules. So for example, like how people work, how organizations buy, how things get founded. And all of those rules arrive much sooner than founders expect. So today, we want to give you a short, honest teaser of what people tend to learn too late. So let's jump on what we have today. So we want to cover three themes, starting with balance approaches building for healthcare versus building for a demo. Then we'll jump to the sharing. We'll be sharing perspective on healthcare from multiple markets. And at the end, we'll try to bold that in healthcare, the buyer is often not the user. Ready?
Ready?
Then let's kick off from the first one. So most early products, the MVP or the pilots, are built to prove one thing. We want to show it works to get the next round of funding or to convince the clinic to try it. And that's completely fine. That's what the MVP is for. But the problem starts when the demo became the product. And founders expect integration to be a later problem. But in healthcare, it comes much earlier. So the moment when the hospital or a trust takes you seriously, they start to ask questions like, how does this connect to what we have already? Or how it fits, does it fit to like how our staff already work? So if you don't have this answer prepared already, the conversation might stop there. And few decisions made in week one are very hard to reverse in year two. So for example, how you store your patient data, how you handle access and audit, the shape of the core, actually. So you don't need to build everything upfront, but you need to build so that scaling later is a step, but not the rebuild, right? So rebuilding for the long term isn't only about the code. It's also what data you decide to capture from the day one. And that's really your word, Fiona.
Yeah, I think when entrepreneurs and innovators are starting out, they often think about that technology, really, don't they? They think, what it does, how people will use it, and what clinical impact it's likely to have. And the goals are understandably always just the next stage, the next stage of funding, a clinical trial, how you're going to get a CE mark or UKCA. And I think people have thought about who will pay, but it often seems so far away, and a concern is always about immediate goals and outcomes. And that is completely understandable. but it's where you start to see a real gap open up between those who move relatively smoothly through the process versus those who take longer to do so. And there are some really good reviews out there of why products fail to scale. And we know that one reason is that innovators tend to focus on technical implementation and the demonstration of clinical benefits rather than how that's going to deliver revenue. So really what you want to know early is your headroom. So what's the maximum someone will pay? Because that's going to tell you where you should point your R&D. Otherwise, I think there's a risk you can build something that works really, really beautifully, but it has got nowhere to go in the reimbursement process.
And that's really painful version we often see. So the code base generally can't fault. Like it works, it's clean. It was just built in a way that it doesn't answer it answered to the wrong question. So the technology was never the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, this isn't just a challenge for SMEs, it happens to those with the deepest pockets as well. So for example, a company called Proteus spent nearly 2 decades and close to 500 million building an ingestible smart pill sensor to track medication adherence. And they reached a $1.5 billion valuation. They got FDA approval for their first digital pill in 2017, but then they really struggled to find a market. And they ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2020, burning $2 million a month. But why they failed is really interesting. So even though this makes sense, right, to track medication adherence, we know this matters, they'd actually struggle to sell people on the technology. So they struggled to sell to insurers because they couldn't articulate just how it was going to create value for health systems. And then if you look at DeepMind, so this is Google, of course, who partnered with the Royal Free in London to build Streams, which is a clinician alerting app for acute kidney injury. And there were issues there, of course, with things like sharing of data, but also their own oversight panel noted that they'd made no revenue on their NHS projects. But the team's position was always saying that essentially we'll prove the technology helps patients, that should come first, and they assumed that the business model would follow, but it never did. And I think, if even the deep pockets of Google can't keep you open indefinitely, it tells you something about how far the idea of, well, it works, is going to get you on your own. And there's really good numbers for this, really good statistics as well. So in studies of novel devices and diagnostics in the US that needed a new Medicare coverage decision, only 44% achieved even nominal coverage by the end of their study. And those that did achieve it waited a median of 5.7 years, some close to 7. And that's a really, really different world from pharma, where coverage tends to follow approval almost immediately. And I think that one of the reasons why this happens is because the barrier to entry in software is much lower, which is great. It democratizes the system, but it does mean that there's also far less discipline early on about what kind of innovation should be funded. And I suppose the reason that this matters so much is that, it's not a secret to the more established companies. And this is the part that I'd really like people to be able to take away. For the established companies, the group that I said would just kind of fly through this process, early health economic modeling is increasingly routine for them. And so that means, and just to be clear about what early health economic modeling is, it's not a really detailed analysis. It's not a full HTA dossier. It's not the kind of submission you're going to build years down the line. At this early stage, you just want to estimate your value. So it should be rough and it should be early estimation so that you know where to focus your attention. And it's not really, exactly how much you're going to price it at. It's just to say, this is where I'm going to focus attention for the next few years. And so if you model that before your trial is designed and before, the architecture is fixed, then the number you're building towards is one that someone is going to pay for later on. And also the evidence that you're going to gather over the next couple of years is the evidence a payer will later ask for. So it gives companies headroom, it tells them which markets are worth their effort. And importantly, it stops people from spending 2 years proving the wrong thing.
Exactly. And where you gather it matters too, right? Because the answer changes depending on which country you're aiming at, which actually brings us to the second thing people learn too late, that the healthcare is not one market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And listen, one of the major challenges, of course, in Europe is that we aren't one market, even though we often pretend that we are. So for people, the decision isn't really, is it the UK or the EU? It's deciding between each of the countries based on multiple factors, but including how long it's going to take you to launch and to get paying customers. Now, there has been a move towards joint clinical assessment in Europe, but even with that, payers still make their economic decisions separately. So the speed at which those countries decide will differ a good deal, and I think that really needs to go into your thinking early on. So from really from the start, I think you'd want to be looking at where those markets overlap in terms of evidence requirement. Think about who's a fast mover, and not just a fast mover in terms of adoption, but also in terms of their entire process. And then also, listen, who pays well. And that's a big part of why you see a substantial number of companies aim for the US as their primary market. But, I think if we stick with Europe, rather than focusing on the US, if we stick with Europe and the Gulf where we also work, there's a fair degree of flux at the moment. And I think there's a lot of changes that it's worth being aware of. So, if we look at the UK, the NHS has just released guidance on value-based procurement. So that's good guidelines for suppliers and buyers in a tender scenario. You'll find that value is going to be scored across 5 domains. So social value, efficiency, payer and staff, supply chain, and purpose, alongside, the whole life cost. So in the efficiency domain, you're going to have to give quantitative evidence against an agreed baseline. So for things like, length of stay, procedure time, readmissions, did not attend rates, bed days, release bed days, these are all important factors that you'll have to prove. And in the patient outcomes domain, you're going to be asked for qualities, for patient-reported outcome measures, for reductions in complications and mortality. And you're going to have to measure it. So there will be a measurement requirement underneath this. And the supplier will have to set out the methodology. They'll have to agree with the baseline with the buyer up front, and then use existing data sources like hospital episode statistics, for example, or registries, and then keep collecting that data after go live. And there's a mechanism to hold the whole product to account, if those promised outcomes don't materialize. And I guess, that's not something you can start to prepare when a tender comes out. It has to be built in early. And I think, you can't be overly optimistic in a scenario, of course, when you're going to be held to account for the outcomes.
I will stop you there, because that line keeps collecting after go live. It's a build requirement that is hiding inside the procurement document.
Yeah.
So if the product wasn't designed to capture that data continuously from the day one, you can't comply later. So no matter how good your outcomes actually are. So that's exactly the kind of things that has to be in the architecture before the tender exists.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be in there long before the tender exists, for sure, and even worse, it's going to differ by country. So if you take Germany, they've made changes to DIGA. So now around 20% of the price will be tied to performance. And there's going to be criteria coming in around adherence. And some of that's going to be really, really challenging for SMEs. And of course, listen, it could change again over the coming years, because there is a bit of conversation around that at the moment. So the challenge, I think, for entrepreneurs and for SMEs is not just whether or not you can deliver the outcomes. It's also the fact that you now have got an ongoing cost to monitor the fact that you've delivered these outcomes. And, Germany's a great market. It's a big market. There's 84 million people. They pay really well for healthcare. Now they are starting to pull back a little on that at the moment, but generally they do pay well. And the vast majority of statutory insurance, with just around, I think, 10 to 13% of their population on private insurance. Now those statutory insurers negotiate together, which is great because it means you don't have to keep on, renegotiating with different payers. But it also does mean that if you get it wrong with that group, it's going to have a big impact on your revenue going forward. Whereas in France, I think it can often look a little bit more straightforward. Reimbursement should get national access. A wealthy country, it's a wealthy country with 60 million inhabitants. They're really, really tech savvy. But on the other side, the reimbursed price is often quite modest. So in France, it'll work at scale, but not so much if you've got small volumes. And actually their approach, their HAS approval approach is really, really rigorous. And so I think then sometimes maybe if you've got approval in the NHS, if you're a solution with approval there, you might find that it's easier to get reimbursed in some countries in the Middle East, because there are a lot of similarities in the process, and in what's an accepted outcome measure. And, I think maybe sometimes people think, especially, when you're at an early stage, that these are a list of countries that may never be relevant to you, they're years in the future. But if you read them early, you start to see these differences like a map. So the overlaps between countries will show you where one piece of evidence that you've collected will actually serve several markets. Or you'll see that connections that exist in like NHS approval will then open doors in the Gulf. And then that can start to tell you, which is the first market that you should lead with. But I think if you leave it too late and you find out you've built for the wrong market, you're sitting in front of a payer, and by then, the fix isn't a tweak. You actually have to rerun your entire trial. But I think these differences probably aren't only commercial, though. They'd probably land on your desk technically as well, wouldn't they?
Yes, they do. But let's try to be a little skeptic first. So from a pure engineering view, building software is broadly similar everywhere. So you need to design it, you need to build architecture around it, and you need to prepare it for scale. So in one sense, the technology doesn't care which country you're in, but in the regulated healthcare, that's not the whole story. So there are differences that really matters, and they're often not written down anywhere. So I was thinking about example within the hosting. So in UK, for some NHS-facing work, Microsoft is broadly expected because so much of the internal ecosystem is already involved within it. So nobody nobody hands you a document that is saying that, but you only know if you build it before. So the real differences are the hosting, the data residency, how the medical data is handled, or how system connects with the other. So my advice for any founder scaling to other markets isn't to learn every rule of every country they want to operate, but instead just have someone on your side who knows really the differences, before you touch the architecture. So the market you lead with should shape the product, while the system must be designed in a way that is easily scalable to other markets. So with that conclusion, we could move to the third part of our meeting. The buyer is often not the user.
Yeah, the buyer is not the user. And, we talk a lot about convincing the buyer, and that's correct. We didn't. I think around 5 or 6 years ago, it was always just about making sure that the clinician was satisfied or the user was satisfied. These days, we have moved on and we're thinking about convincing the buyer, and we're thinking about the finance department, not just the clinician, which is great. But to really earn revenue and to keep that revenue going, you now have to think about user adherence too. So it's not just that kind of theoretical satisfaction where somebody looks at your solution and they tell you that it works really nicely, they can see where it fits. It also has to be whether or not they continue to use it over a period of time. And I think, that sounds really, really obvious to people, that of course people need to be satisfied. But recent changes have turned this into a real focal point. So value is increasingly being judged not just on whether or not your solution works, but on whether or not people actually use it. And, at the moment, that's mainly for patient-facing tools, but I would think if it works nicely and people are happy with it, it's going to spill over into workflow tools as well. And the reason it's come to the fore is because of guidance coming out of Germany and the NHS. And, listen, I know I can sound like I only ever talk about these two as being the main countries to look at, but they do tend to be forerunners in setting up clear funding pathways. And we often find that where they go, others will tweak and follow, even if they don't, have the same approach. They tend to look at the systems coming out of Germany and coming out of NICE and the NHS as well. So if we go back to, that example I gave about DIGA 2.0, the reimbursement criteria now include adherence. And adherence has always mattered to payers, but now it's really, really tightly tied in as an outcome measure. So how much something is used, and even self-reported satisfaction will feed into whether or not your payment continues. So you have to keep people using it. But going back to that point about the cost that this has for SMEs, you have to be able to show that they're happy with it as well. And that's going to have an impact, of course, on the build. So the NHS guidance will point the same way. They talk about the ease of use. They talk about how simplicity drives compliance. They talk about inclusive and equitable design. And these are now things that you have to kind of look at and speak to early in a tender. But importantly enough, you have to be able to follow up on it as well. And probably that split, the buyer versus user, has to show up in how the product is actually built as well, doesn't it?
So it does. So you still need to build a great experience for the user, the clinician or the patient, but you also have to build the part that proves the value to the buyer. So, for example, we can build dashboards and metrics that show what the organization gains, like time saved or faster patient handling or less duplicated work. And like one example of our client, so we built a clinical operations product where staff used to log in and go straight into the patient details. So there we moved the value metrics to the top of the screen after login. So in the same product, now the value is visible. That design choice is aimed at the buyer and not the user. And the hard truth is healthcare punishes disruption.
True.
So in most software, any changes are acceptable and users quite easily adapt. But in hospitals, if you're not careful with changing your interface for a busy clinician, he might stop using it at all, like no matter how good the technology is. So the change must make the real workflow better, not only different. So this is also where vibe coding comes in the AI-generated prototypes. So generally, I have good news. So prototypes are now cheap and fast. So more ideas get off the ground. But you build for demo, and it won't survive in a regulated market. So we regularly audit projects in the ULAM Labs like this. And what we usually see is the app that looks fine from the first glance. But the problem in most of them is like patient data is handled very often in illegal way, and simply because the founder didn't know the rules. And in general, vibe-coded MVPs are fine for the initial stages, but never for kicking off real projects.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway is a practical one. You know, you need to be building in how you capture usage and satisfaction from the very start with developers before launch, because it's probably really hard for you then to retrofit that once the product is out in the world.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, you know, if we bring the threads together from today, successful healthcare adoption depends on maybe 4 things lining up. So product design, workflow integration, evidence generation, and the funding pathway. And often people think about them as separate stages, but really, I guess the way we look at it is that it's one pathway, you know, and it's one conversation.
Yeah, and like from the build side, that show up in 3 places, like building for the demo, building for the system, not for the demo. Then the fact that healthcare isn't one market, and that the buyer is rarely the user. So like 3 angles gives us one lesson, that the rules of the system aren't something you handle after you build. So they're what you design around from the day one. Then remember about building. So scaling is a step, not a rebuild. Try to keep it cheap early, leave it expensive for later.
Yeah. And I think they're probably just 3 of the places, you know, that we see teams get caught out in. And there's plenty more, and hopefully, as we said, we'll be able to touch on those in the future, but we just haven't looked at those today. But maybe just as we're kind of coming close to time, happy to go to some questions if there's any questions from the audience. See one coming through there. How early is too early for economic modeling, and don't we need clinical data first before we can model anything? So thanks a million. And yes, that was definitely the way we were looking about it in the past. So it used to be that, yeah, you'd start your clinical trial and you collect your data as you were going through, and you'd start to do your economic model. But now the way we look at it is that we start to say, you know, okay, let's say you've got remote patient monitoring, and you're wondering, is this something you do in the community? Is this something that you're going to do maybe in virtual wards or in post-hospital discharge? we would actually take some of the literature that exists at the moment. So we would sit there and say, what's going to actually happen to your patients? What's the pathway they go through? What do you think that your intended benefit is going to be like? And we're able to model that fairly rapidly, looking at the kind of cost savings that you will deliver for the healthcare system. So I think you can simulate. As I say, it's never going to be perfect. So the data and the model that you come up with in that first instance is not going to be the one that you then send into, your buyer in the future, but it certainly gives you a lot of direction just through a simulation.
I think there's nothing to add from my side, basically.
Nothing there. Anything else to add?
Yeah, let's give it a few more seconds.
Just in case your people are typing, yeah.
Okay, so looks like there is no more question for now. So thanks a lot, at least for this one. So we hope today's webinar was useful for you. And everyone who registered will get an email with our ebook, but you can also scan it now. So please don't be scared about the size of it. So you can dive in within the 40 pages that covers the topic, from pilot to paid adoption. And if you would like us to take a look at your own product and build a route to adoption, that's exactly what we do together in our workshops. So QA code is on the screen too. So thanks a lot for joining us. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks a million. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.